The Court of Shadows had witnessed countless executions over the centuries, screams that echoed through stone corridors, pleas for mercy that fell on deaf ears, the satisfying crack of breaking bones. But this was something entirely new. Lord Valdris, eldest of the Vampire Council, took an involuntary step backward, his pale lips parting in disbelief. The executioner, a creature they called the Maw, born from forbidden magic that merged the most vicious aspects of vampire and wolf, remained frozen with its fangs still pressed against Ilara's hand. Thick saliva dripped from its muzzle onto the stone floor, each drop echoing like thunder in the sudden quiet. Ilara's smile never wavered. She studied the creature's yellow eyes with the same gentle curiosity she might show a rare flower in her laboratory. "There now," she whispered, her voice carrying the soft lilt of someone comforting a wounded animal. "I know you didn't want to do this." The Maw's ears flattened against its skull. A whimper escaped its throat, a sound none of the assembled vampires had ever heard from their fearsome executioner. The creature released her hand and stumbled backward, massive claws scraping against stone. "Impossible," breathed Lady Morgana from her throne carved of blackened bone. Her crimson eyes, which had burned with righteous fury moments before, now held something far more dangerous: uncertainty. The bite should have turned you, or killed you, or driven me mad with pain. Ilara flexed her fingers, the fang marks already reduced to faint pink lines. "Yes, I imagine that's usually how these proceedings go." She clasped her hands before her, the picture of serenity despite the iron shackles around her wrists. "Though I must say your court has a rather dramatic flair. All these torches and ceremonial daggers, quite atmospheric." Lord Cassius, youngest of the vampire lords at merely 3 centuries old, hissed through elongated fangs. "She mocks us. This proves nothing except that she's some manner of witch. Perhaps the same dark magic that let her poison our brothers now protects." "Protects me?" Ilara's amber eyes flashed, though her smile remained gentle. "My lords, if I possessed such powerful dark magic, would I not have used it to escape your dungeons these past 3 days? Would I not have struck you down where you stand rather than submit to your hospitality?" She gestured to the damp straw clinging to her once fine burgundy dress, to the shadows beneath her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights on cold stone. Her silver-streaked hair, usually bound in an elegant chignon, hung loose around her shoulders like a curtain of moonlight. Valdris circled her slowly, his movements predatory despite his obvious unease. "Then explain it, Lady Blackthorn. Explain how you remain untouched by the Maw's bite. Explain how moonflowers, harmless herbs used by village healers, became poison in your hands." Ilara's gaze followed his movement, but she made no attempt to turn away or cower. In the dancing torchlight, her face showed only sadness. "The moonflowers weren't poisoned, my lord. They were precisely what I've always created. Healing remedies for those who suffer. Our brothers are dead." Lady Morgana's voice cracked like a whip across the chamber. "Lord Demetrius, Lord Alexandru, and Lord Gregor, all fell within hours of consuming your healing elixirs." "Yes." The simple word hung in the air like a funeral bell. Ilara's expression grew distant, remembering. "They came to my laboratory 3 nights apart, each bearing wounds that wouldn't heal. Old injuries, they said, from battles fought decades ago. They begged me for something, anything that might ease their suffering." She paused, meeting each vampire's gaze in turn. "I gave them exactly what they asked for. Peace." The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop another degree. Lord Cassius's hand moved instinctively to the ceremonial blade at his hip. "You admit to murdering them." "I admit to ending their torment." Ilara's voice remained steady, though moisture gathered in her eyes. "Those weren't battle wounds, my lords. They were marks of something far older and more terrible, a corruption that was slowly devouring them from within. The moonflower essence simply hastened the inevitable." "Lies," Valdris snarled, though uncertainty flickered across his pale features. "You speak in riddles to confuse us." Ilara shook her head, silver hair catching the torchlight. "I speak only the truth, though I understand why you might not recognize it. When was the last time someone in your court chose honesty over survival?" The Moor, still cowering near the chamber's edge, let out another whimper. Its eyes remained fixed on Alara with an expression that looked disturbingly like worship. Lady Morgana rose from her throne, midnight black gown flowing around her like smoke. "Enough games. If you won't explain your immunity, we'll simply have to test it more thoroughly." She gestured toward the wall where other implements waited: silver blades, vials of holy water, chains blessed by long-dead priests. Alara's smile finally faded. She looked at the assembled court with something approaching pity. "You still don't understand, do you? This isn't about immunity. It's about what I am, what I've always been." The silence stretched like a held breath. Alara could feel the weight of their stares, the hunger in their ancient eyes as they waited for her to elaborate. But instead of explaining further, she closed her eyes and let her mind drift backward, away from this chamber of shadows and judgment, back to the life they had torn her from just 3 days ago. 3 days. Had it really been such a short time? It felt like months since she had last stood in her laboratory, grinding moonflower petals by candlelight while rain drummed against the diamond-paned windows of Blackthorn Manor. The memory felt so vivid she could almost smell the herbs drying in neat bundles from the rafters, could almost hear the gentle bubbling of her distillation apparatus. Her morning had begun as it always did, before dawn, with a cup of chamomile tea and her leather-bound journal, where she recorded the previous day's observations. The moonflowers had been particularly responsive to the new soil mixture she'd been experimenting with, their silvery blooms opening wider than she'd ever seen. She had been so pleased with the progress, had planned to take cuttings that very evening to expand her greenhouse cultivation. The greenhouse. Her heart clenched at the thought of it now, the delicate glass structure attached to the manor's east wing, filled with specimens she had spent years nurturing. Who was tending them now? Mrs. Aldrich, her elderly housekeeper, knew enough to water the common herbs, but the rarer plants, the blood orchids that bloomed only under specific moon phases, the whispering vines that required daily songs to thrive, they would be dying without her careful attention. And what of her patients? Every Tuesday and Friday, villagers climbed the winding mountain path to her door, bringing their ailments and their desperate hopes. Young mothers with colicky babies, old men whose joints screamed with each winter morning, children covered in rashes that the village physician couldn't identify. She had built her reputation over decades, not as Lady Alara Blackthorn, daughter of minor nobility, but as the herb lady who could cure what others could not. There was little Willem, barely 8 years old, whose fever dreams had been growing worse each week. His mother had promised to return yesterday for the special tisane Alara had been preparing, a delicate blend that required precise timing to reach its full potency. Without it, the boy would likely succumb before the month's end. And elderly Henrik, whose war wound from his soldiering days had begun festering again after 20 years of dormancy. She had been so close to identifying the right combination of cleansing herbs and strengthening tonics. Another week, perhaps 2, and she could have saved his leg from amputation. "You grow quiet, Lady Blackthorn." Valdris's voice cut through her reverie like a blade through silk. "Perhaps you realize the gravity of—" "I was thinking of my roses," Alara said softly, her eyes still closed. The admission surprised even her. Of all the things she could have mentioned, why roses? But suddenly she could see them so clearly, the climbing varieties that covered the manor's southern wall in cascades of pink and white, the hybrid specimens she had been developing in secret for nearly a decade. She opened her eyes to find the vampires staring at her with expressions ranging from confusion to outrage. "My roses," she repeated, a wistful smile touching her lips. "This morning, was it only 3 days ago? I was planning to attempt a new grafting technique. I've been working to create a bloom that could thrive in both sunlight and shadow, something beautiful enough to bridge the gap between day and night." Lady Morgana's laugh was like breaking glass. "Roses. You speak of roses while on trial for murder." "I speak of life," Ilara replied simply. "Of growth and beauty and the simple pleasure of nurturing something from seed to bloom. These are the things that matter, my lady. These are the things worth preserving." She thought of her private study, lined floor to ceiling, with journals documenting 30 years of botanical research. Pressed flowers marked the pages like bookmarks, each one a memory, a successful experiment, a life saved through careful observation and patient trial. Her grandmother's recipes were in there too, written in fading ink and annotated with Ilara's own discoveries. Generations of knowledge that would be lost forever if she never returned. But it wasn't just the knowledge, it was the purpose. For 3 decades, she had risen each morning with the certainty that her work mattered, that every dried herb and carefully measured tincture brought healing to a world that desperately needed it. She had never married, never had children of her own, because her calling had always been clear, to serve as a bridge between the natural world and human suffering. "You think us monsters," Lord Cassius observed, studying her face with unsettling intensity. Ilara considered this, tilting her head slightly. "I think you've forgotten what it means to create rather than destroy, to heal rather than harm." Her voice carried a note of genuine sadness. "When did you last feel wonder at something as simple as a flower opening to greet the dawn?" The moor whimpered again from its corner, and Ilara's attention shifted to the creature with the same gentle focus she gave her most delicate plants. "What are you?" Valdris whispered. Before Ilara could answer Valdris's whispered question, the great doors of the chamber burst open with a sound like thunder splitting stone. The torches guttered in the sudden rush of wind, casting wild shadows across the walls as a figure strode into the court of shadows with the confidence of someone who had every right to be there. The newcomer was tall and lean, draped in a traveling cloak that bore the unmistakable scent of distant places. Pine forests, mountain snow, and something else that made the vampires instinctively recoil. Beneath the hood, sharp green eyes surveyed the assembled court with obvious disdain. "Brother Marcus," Lady Morgana breathed, her voice a mixture of surprise and poorly concealed fear. "You were not summoned." The man, Marcus, pushed back his hood to reveal iron-grey hair and a face marked by years of hard travel. When he smiled, Ilara noticed his teeth were perfectly, unnaturally white. "Since when do I require permission to attend court proceedings, especially ones involving such interesting accusations?" His gaze found Ilara, and something shifted in his expression. Not recognition exactly, but a kind of careful assessment that made her skin prickle. She had the distinct impression of being measured against some invisible standard. "You arrive at a fortuitous time," Lord Cassius said, though his tone suggested he considered it anything but fortunate. "We were just determining what manner of creature stands before us. The woman shows immunity to the Moor's bite." Marcus moved closer to Ilara with predatory grace, circling her as Valdris had done earlier. But where the vampire lord's attention had felt threatening, this man's scrutiny carried a different weight, the focused intensity of a scholar examining a rare specimen. "Show me your hand," he commanded. Ilara hesitated for only a moment before extending her right hand. The fang marks had faded to barely visible pink lines, and as Marcus examined them, his fingers were surprisingly warm against her skin. "Remarkable," he murmured. Then, loud enough for the court to hear, "When did you first manifest this resistance, Lady Blackthorn?" "I don't understand the question." But even as she spoke the words, Ilara felt something stirring in the depths of her memory. Fragments of childhood nightmares, her grandmother's worried whispers, the way certain plants seemed to thrive under her touch in ways that defied botanical logic. Marcus's green eyes bored into hers. "Think carefully. Has there never been an incident, a moment when you should have been harmed but walked away untouched? When healing came too quickly, too completely?" The memory hit her like a physical blow. She was 12 years old again, exploring the caves behind Blackthorn Manor, despite her grandmother's strict warnings. The creature that had attacked her in those depths, something with glowing eyes and razor teeth that had torn open her shoulder before fleeing at her scream. But when she stumbled home hours later, sobbing and covered in blood, the wound had already sealed itself, Her grandmother had stared at the unmarked skin for a long moment before burning Ilara's torn dress and making her promise never to speak of what happened. "I see the recognition in her eyes," Marcus announced to the court. "She begins to understand." Lady Morgana rose from her throne, midnight gown billowing. "Understand what, brother? Speak plainly." "What stands before you," Marcus said, his voice carrying across the stone chamber with ceremonial weight, "is the last of a bloodline we thought extinct for over a century. Behold, a light-bearer." The word fell into the chamber's silence, like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of shock through the assembled vampires. Lord Valdris actually stumbled backward, his pale face growing even whiter. The Moor, still cowering in its corner, began to whine continuously, a low, distressed sound that spoke of recognition beyond human understanding. Ilara felt the world tilt beneath her feet. "That's impossible. The light-bearers are legend, stories my grandmother told to help me sleep." "Your grandmother was Seraphina Lightbearer," Marcus continued relentlessly. "She fled here after the Purge, took the name Blackthorn, and tried to live as an ordinary human. But the blood doesn't lie dormant forever. It awakens when it's needed most." The pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. Her grandmother's careful isolation, the way she had trained Ilara to heal with herbs rather than other methods. The suspicious deaths of the 3 vampire lords who had come seeking her help, not because her moonflowers were poisoned, but because her very presence had acted as a cleansing force against whatever corruption was consuming them. "If this is true," Lady Morgana said, her voice deadly quiet, "then she cannot be allowed to leave this chamber alive." The treaties, Marcus interrupted, "state that no light-bearer may be harmed while under the protection of one who shares their blood." He pulled back his cloak to reveal armor beneath, not the ceremonial kind worn by the court, but practical leather and steel marked with symbols that seemed to drink in the torchlight. "I claim right of kinship." Ilara stared at him in growing horror. "You're my cousin. Distant, but the connection runs true." Marcus's smile held no warmth. "Which means, dear Ilara, that you now face a choice. Come with me and learn what you truly are, what responsibilities your awakening blood demands of you." He gestured toward the assembled vampires, whose expressions had shifted from confusion to naked hunger. "Or remain here and face the consequences of revelation." The chamber held its breath, waiting for her answer. The weight of Marcus's words settled over the chamber like a burial shroud, and Ilara felt as though the stone floor beneath her feet had transformed into quicksand. Every breath seemed to require conscious effort, as the full magnitude of her situation crashed down upon her with relentless force. Lightbearer. The word echoed in her mind like a death knell, dredging up fragments of her grandmother's bedtime stories that now took on sinister new meaning. Tales of ancient guardians who walked between worlds, whose very essence could purify corruption or, as the vampire's hungry stares suggested, destroy it entirely. "I need time to think," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the chamber's oppressive silence. Marcus's laugh was sharp as winter wind. "Time is a luxury you no longer possess, cousin. The moment I spoke your true nature aloud, you became the most valuable and dangerous creature in both realms." Ilara's gaze swept the assembled court, reading the avarice and calculation in their ancient faces. Lord Valdris's fingers drummed against his ceremonial blade's hilt. Lady Morgana's midnight eyes gleamed with barely contained hunger. Even young Lord Cassius, who moments ago had seemed merely confused, now studied her as a merchant might appraise a particularly rare gemstone. The irony wasn't lost on her. 3 days ago, she had been Lady Ilara Blackthorn, botanical alchemist and healer, a woman whose greatest concern was whether Mrs. Aldrich remembered to water the greenhouse orchids. Now she stood at the crossroads of 2 impossible paths, each leading toward a future she couldn't bear to contemplate. If she went with Marcus, what would become of her life's work? Who would tend the moonflowers that bloomed only under her careful cultivation? Who would prepare the tisanes that kept the mountain villagers healthy through harsh winters? The thought of little Willem's fever consuming him while she learned to be something she'd never wanted to become made her stomach clench with guilt. But staying meant what? She studied the vampires' faces again, noting how their earlier confusion had crystallized into predatory focus. They would never simply let her return to her greenhouse and her roses. The knowledge of what she was had transformed her from a suspected murderess into something far more dangerous, a weapon that every supernatural power would want to control. "The responsibilities your awakening blood demands," she repeated Marcus's words slowly, tasting their bitter implications. What responsibilities? I never asked for this heritage. I never wanted anything more than to heal the sick and tend my gardens. Marcus stepped closer, his green eyes reflecting an intensity that made her skin crawl. Want is irrelevant. You are what you are, whether you accept it or not. The question is whether you'll learn to wield your power with purpose or let it consume you and everyone around you through ignorance. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Ilara thought of her quiet manner on the mountainside, of Mrs. Aldrich humming as she prepared morning tea, of the villagers who trusted her enough to climb treacherous paths seeking her help. If her awakening power was indeed beyond her control, how many innocent lives might she destroy simply by returning home? "And if I refuse both choices?" she asked, though she already knew the answer from Marcus's predatory smile. "Then you'll die here, tonight, and the last hope for peace between our worlds dies with you." His voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "The vampire clans are already mobilizing for war. The werewolf packs grow restless. Only a light bearer can restore the balance, but only if she survives long enough to fulfill her purpose." Ilara closed her eyes, trying to block out the hungry stares, the oppressive weight of destiny she'd never sought. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she could see her greenhouse again, the delicate glass walls catching morning sunlight, the careful rows of healing herbs she'd spent decades perfecting. Such a simple life, such a peaceful existence. When she'd been 12 and found herself mysteriously healed after that creature's attack, her grandmother had made her promise to never speak of it. Now she understood why. Serafina Lightbearer had sacrificed everything, her identity, her heritage, her very nature, to give her granddaughter a chance at normalcy. "How long?" she asked without opening her eyes. "How long can you guarantee my protection if I come with you?" "Protection?" Marcus's laugh held no warmth. "Dear cousin, you misunderstand. I'm not offering to protect you. I'm offering to teach you to protect yourself, and everyone else who'll die if you don't." The chamber remained silent, waiting. Ilara could feel the weight of their collective attention like a physical pressure against her skin. The Moor's continued whimpering seemed to echo her own internal turmoil, the sound of a creature caught between instincts it couldn't reconcile. She thought of Willem's fever, of Henrik's festering wound, of all the patients who would suffer without her care. Then she thought of Marcus's words about war, about the innocent lives that would be lost if the supernatural world erupted into chaos. Every choice led away from the life she'd built, the purpose she'd found in her quiet calling as a healer. But perhaps some sacrifices were too important to refuse, no matter how deeply they cut. The question was, which sacrifice would ultimately serve the greater good? Ilara opened her eyes and met Marcus's unforgiving stare. In that moment of crystalline clarity, she realized there had never truly been a choice at all. The woman who had awakened 3 days ago in her peaceful greenhouse had died the instant the Moor's fangs pierced her skin without consequence. What stood here now was something else, something that carried the weight of bloodlines and ancient responsibilities she couldn't escape. "I'll come with you," she said quietly. The words tasted like ash in her mouth, but she forced them out anyway. "But I have conditions." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You're hardly in a position to negotiate, cousin." "Aren't I?" Ilara straightened her shoulders, drawing upon reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. "You said yourself that I'm the last hope for peace between worlds. That makes me rather valuable, doesn't it?" Lady Morgana's cold laughter echoed off the stone walls. Listen to her, Marcus. The little flower thinks she has power here. But Marcus held up a hand for silence, his green eyes never leaving Alara's face. Speak your conditions. I want guarantees that my household will be protected. Mrs. Aldrich has served my family faithfully for 30 years. She deserves to live out her days in peace. Alara's voice grew stronger with each word. And I want time to prepare medicines for the villagers who depend on me. Willem needs his fever broken, Henrik requires treatment for his wound, and there are others. Impossible. Lord Valdres stepped forward, his pale features twisted with hunger. You cannot be allowed to return to your precious village. Not now that we know what you are. Then people will die unnecessarily, Alara said simply. Children will succumb to fevers that could be easily cured. Wounds will fester and claim lives that could be saved. Is that the peace you're hoping to achieve? Marcus studied her for a long moment, and Alara could practically see him weighing options behind those calculating eyes. 3 days, he said finally. I'll give you 3 days to set your affairs in order, but you don't go alone, and you don't leave my sight. The compromise felt like a small victory, though Alara knew it came at a price she hadn't yet calculated. And Mrs. Aldrich will be relocated somewhere safe, with a pension generous enough to ensure her comfort. Marcus's expression suggested this concession pained him. Consider it an investment in your cooperation. Alara nodded, then turned to face the assembled court. These ancient creatures who had terrified her only hours ago now seemed almost pathetic in their naked hunger for power. You wanted to know what I am, she said, her voice carrying across the stone chamber with unexpected authority. I am a healer. I am someone who chooses to create rather than destroy, to mend rather than break. If that heritage makes me your enemy, perhaps you should ask yourselves what that says about your own nature. Lord Cassius shifted uncomfortably. You speak of healing, yet 3 of our kind died after seeking your aid. They died because their corruption ran too deep for any cure, Alara replied, the knowledge rising from some instinctive place she was only beginning to understand. Their own choices poisoned them long before they ever came to my door. I cannot heal a soul that refuses to acknowledge its wounds. The truth of her words hung in the chamber's stifling air, and Alara saw several of the vampires exchange uneasy glances. The Moor's whimpering had stopped, replaced by something that almost sounded like hope. Marcus stepped to her side, his presence both protective and proprietary. We leave within the hour. Say whatever farewells you need to say to this place. You won't be seeing it again. As they moved toward the great doors, Alara cast one final look back at the Court of Shadows. These creatures had tried to judge her, to break her, to claim her for their own purposes. Instead, they had awakened something that might prove far more dangerous to them than they could imagine. The Moor raised its massive head as she passed, and for just a moment, their eyes met. In those alien depths, she saw recognition of a kinship that transcended the boundaries of species or supernatural politics, 2 creatures caught between worlds, struggling to understand their place in an order they hadn't chosen. Soon, she whispered, too quietly for the vampires to hear. It wasn't a threat or a promise, simply an acknowledgement of something that would come to pass. Then the doors closed behind them with a sound like thunder, sealing away the life she had known and thrusting her into a darkness she was only beginning to comprehend. The threshold had been crossed. There would be no returning to her roses now. The corridors beyond the Court of Shadows stretched endlessly into gloom, lit by torches that cast dancing shadows on walls carved with symbols Alara couldn't read, but somehow understood. The air tasted of centuries, dust and decay, old blood and older secrets. Each step echoed with finality, marking her passage from one life into another. Marcus walked beside her with the fluid grace of a predator, his armor gleaming dully in the flickering light. The first lesson, he said without preamble, is that nothing you thought you knew about your world is complete. The supernatural realm operates by different rules, older rules, written in blood and bound by oaths that predate human civilization. They passed alcoves, where creatures she couldn't name watched from the darkness. Beings with too many eyes, others with none at all, some that seemed to shift between forms as shadows fell across them. None spoke, but Ilara felt their attention like weight pressing against her skin. "Why are they staring?" she asked, hating the tremor in her voice. "Because they can sense what you are, even if they don't fully understand it. To them, you're both salvation and destruction walking hand in hand." Marcus paused at an intersection of 3 passages, choosing the leftmost path without hesitation. Light-bearers were peacekeepers once, mediators between realms, but they were also executioners when negotiation failed. The corridor opened into a vast cavern lit by phosphorescent fungi that painted everything in sickly green hues. Ancient machinery lined the walls, gears and pipes and contraptions that hummed with purposes beyond her comprehension. At the center sat a woman who might have been beautiful once, before whatever transformation had left her skin translucent and her eyes like chips of winter sky. "Vera," Marcus said respectfully. "I've brought her." The woman, creature, rose from her seat with movements that seemed to flow like water. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that made Ilara's bones ache. So, the dormant bloodline awakens at last. She circled Ilara slowly, studying her with those terrible pale eyes. "She's weak, untrained. How do you expect her to face what's coming?" "That's why we're here," Marcus replied. "She needs to understand her heritage before she can embrace it." Vera laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Understanding is luxury. What she needs is survival." Without warning, she lunged forward, fingers extended like claws. Instinct took over. Ilara raised her hand defensively and light erupted from her palm. Not the warm glow of candle flame, but something pure and white-hot that sent Vera staggering backward with a shriek of pain. "There," Vera gasped, cradling burned fingers against her chest. "Now she begins to learn." Ilara stared at her own hand in horror. The skin showed no sign of whatever force had just erupted from it, but she could still feel the echo of that power thrumming through her veins like liquid fire. "What did I just do?" "You defended yourself," Marcus said, his voice carrying approval that made her stomach turn. "The light responds to will, to need. It cannot be forced, only channeled." "I could have killed her." "Yes," Vera said simply, her burned fingers already healing with unnatural speed. "That is precisely the point. You are not some gentle village healer anymore, child. You are a weapon forged by bloodlines that shaped the balance between worlds. The sooner you accept that, the better your chances of living through what comes next." The chamber seemed to spin around Ilara as the implications crashed over her. All those years of careful cultivation, of gentle healing, of choosing life over death at every turn, and her true nature was that of a destroyer. "This is madness. I won't become some kind of executioner." "You think you have a choice?" Vera moved closer again, more cautiously this time. "The war is already beginning. Vampire clans mass in the eastern valleys, werewolf packs descend from the northern peaks. Ancient grudges awaken, old treaties crumble, without a light-bearer to restore balance." She gestured toward the machinery lining the walls. "All of this, every attempt at civilization we've built in the shadows, burns to ash." Marcus placed a hand on Ilara's shoulder, his touch surprisingly gentle. "I told you that you would learn to protect yourself and others. This is how it begins. The light that flows in your veins can heal or harm, create or destroy. The choice of which path to follow remains yours, but only if you're strong enough to enforce that choice." Through the cavern's entrance, new sounds echoed, footsteps, voices raised in anger, the scrape of metal on stone. Vera's head snapped up, her pale eyes narrowing. "They followed us," she hissed. "Marcus, you fool, you led them straight here." "Who followed?" Ilara demanded. But even as she spoke, she could hear the answer approaching. The vampire lords from the court, their voices carrying deadly intent. "Lesson 2, Marcus said grimly, drawing his blade. "Trust is earned in blood, and enemies gather like storm clouds." The real tests were about to begin. The approach. The footsteps grew louder, echoing through stone passages like thunder before a storm. Ilara counted at least 6 distinct voices, their words too distant to understand, but their tone unmistakably hostile. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she realized the full scope of her situation, trapped in an underground cavern with strangers whose loyalties remained unclear, while vampire lords who saw her as either weapon or threat approached with murderous intent. "How many?" Marcus asked Vera, his blade singing as he tested its edge. "All of them," she replied, moving to a wall panel covered in those incomprehensible symbols. Her fingers danced across the markings with practiced speed. Valdris leads, with Morgana and Cassius flanking. The others follow. Ancient gears grown to life as hidden mechanisms responded to her touch. They bring the Shadow Guard. Ilara didn't know what Shadow Guards were, but Marcus's sharp intake of breath suggested nothing good. Defensive positions, then. We hold them at the entrance. No. Vera's pale eyes blazed with sudden intensity. She needs to see what she's truly capable of. Theory means nothing without practice, and they've given us the perfect testing ground. Absolutely not, Ilara said, backing away from both of them. I won't be your experiment in some underground battle. I'm not a weapon. Marcus sheathed his sword and turned to face her, his expression caught between exasperation and something that might have been pity. Look at me, cousin. Really look. He rolled back his sleeves, revealing arms crisscrossed with old scars, some clearly from blades, others bearing the distinctive puncture marks of fangs. Every one of these was earned protecting the balance between worlds. Every drop of blood I've spilled, every life I've taken, every choice that carved pieces from my soul, all in service of preventing the kind of war that's now building beyond these walls. The approaching voices grew clearer. Ilara caught fragments. Hunt her down like, cannot be allowed to, tear her apart and scatter. Her hands began to shake. 3 days ago, her greatest fear had been running out of dried valerian root before the next market day. Now ancient creatures planned her destruction in terms that suggested they'd done this before, to others like her. They want to kill me, she whispered. They want to control you, Vera corrected, her fingers still working the wall mechanisms. Grinding sounds echoed from hidden places as stone passages began shifting. Death would be merciful compared to what Valdris has in mind. He remembers the old ways, how previous light-bearers were, persuaded to serve specific interests. Marcus moved closer to Ilara, his voice dropping to urgent whispers. The power that burned Vera's fingers, you barely scratched its surface. Light-bearers once ended wars with gestures, brought peace to realms that had bled for centuries. But that same force can shatter minds, burn souls to ash, remake the very fabric of reality. His green eyes searched hers desperately. You can choose to be a healer or a destroyer, but first you must survive long enough to make that choice. The cavern's entrance darkened as figures appeared, tall silhouettes wreathed in shadows that moved independently of their bodies. Lord Valdris stepped into the phosphorescent light, his ceremonial blade now naked in his hand. The metal gleamed with inscriptions that seemed to writhe across its surface. "Lady Blackthorn," he called, his voice carrying false warmth. "There's no need for this unpleasantness. Come with us willingly and we can discuss terms that benefit everyone." "Terms?" Ilara found her voice despite her terror. "You mean my enslavement?" Lady Morgana emerged from the shadows beside Valdris, her midnight eyes fixed on Ilara with predatory hunger. "Enslavement is such an ugly word. We prefer guided service. The supernatural realm has been without proper leadership for far too long." Behind them, shapes moved in the darkness. The Shadow Guards, Ilara realized. They looked like men once, but whatever they'd become defied easy description. Their forms seemed to drink light, leaving holes in the air where they stood. Marcus's hand found her shoulder again, steadying her even as she felt him tense for battle. "Remember what just happened with Vera. The light responds to need, to will. Trust your instincts." "My instincts tell me to run," Ilara whispered back. "Then we run forward," he replied. and something in his voice reminded her suddenly of her grandmother. The same quiet steel that had carried Seraphina Lightbearer through whatever trials had shaped her into the woman who could sacrifice everything for her granddaughter's chance at peace. Vera's mechanisms clicked into final position. Stone barriers began grinding closed across several passages, limiting the vampire's approach routes. "Choose quickly, girl. Stand and learn what you are, or die here as what you've always been." The shadow guards moved forward like liquid darkness given purpose, and Elara felt that strange fire beginning to build in her veins again, not the gentle warmth of healing, but something vast and terrible and utterly beyond her understanding. The approach had ended. The real test was about to begin. The ordeal begins. The fire in her veins erupted without warning. Elara screamed, not in pain but in shock at the raw force pouring through her body like molten starlight. The cavern exploded into brilliance as light burst from her skin, her eyes, her very breath. The shadow guards recoiled with inhuman shrieks, their forms wavering like smoke in a hurricane. "Control it," Marcus shouted over the roar of unleashed power. "Don't let it consume you." But control seemed impossible. The light had its own will, its own hunger, and it wanted nothing more than to burn away every trace of darkness in the chamber. Elara felt herself lifted from the stone floor, suspended in a cocoon of blazing energy that made the very air sing with harmonics that touched something primal in every creature present. Lord Valdris staggered backward, his ancient blade clattering from nerveless fingers. "Impossible," he gasped. "No dormant bloodline should possess such." His words became screams, as Elara's unfocused power lashed out like a whip of pure destruction. Where it touched him, centuries of vampiric transformation began unraveling. His pale skin darkened, aged, cracked. His elongated fangs shortened back to human proportions. For one terrible moment, Elara saw him as he must have been before his turning, a young man with frightened eyes and mortality written in every line of his face. Then the power snapped back into her like a rubber band released, and she crashed to the cavern floor hard enough to taste blood. "What have I done?" she whispered, staring at her hands in horror. Steam rose from her palms, and her fingertips glowed with residual light that pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat. Dear God, what have I become? Valdris lay motionless against the cavern wall, neither dead nor truly alive, caught in some terrible middle state between his vampiric nature and the humanity she'd accidentally restored. His eyes tracked her movement, filled with an agony that went beyond physical pain. Lady Morgana knelt beside her fallen lord, her midnight eyes blazing with fury. "You've broken him," she snarled. "Torn away centuries of careful evolution, left him trapped between forms like some mewling half-breed." Her voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than her shouts. "For this, little light-bearer, you will learn suffering that makes death seem merciful." The remaining shadow guards spread out in a semicircle, their forms stabilizing now that Elara's power had retreated. She could see them more clearly now, men who had been hollowed out and filled with living darkness, their eyes replaced by pits of starless void, their mouths stretching too wide across faces that remembered humanity but could no longer achieve it. Marcus stepped protectively in front of her, his sword gleaming with its own subtle radiance. "Vera, we need those passages open. Now." "Working on it," Vera called back, her translucent fingers flying across another panel of symbols. But the mechanisms weren't designed for rapid reversal. The stone needs time to... A shadow guard struck without warning, moving faster than thought. Its claws raked across Marcus's chest, parting armor like paper and drawing blood that steamed in the phosphorescent air. He spun with inhuman grace, his blade describing a perfect arc that should have taken the creature's head from its shoulders. Instead, his sword passed harmlessly through shadow stuff that reformed an instant later. The shadow guard's laughter was the sound of children crying in empty houses. "Iron cannot cut the darkness between stars," it whispered in a voice like dying wind. "Only light can banish what light has abandoned." Elara struggled to her feet, her body still trembling from the aftershock of power. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to hide, to return to her roses and pretend none of this was real. But Marcus was bleeding, Valdris lay broken by her uncontrolled strength, and more shadow guards were emerging from the passage behind Morgana, an endless tide of hungry darkness that would consume everything in its path. She thought of Willem with his fever, Henrik with his infected wound, all the villagers who depended on her gentle healing. She thought of Mrs. Aldrich, who had raised her with such careful love. She thought of her grandmother, who had sacrificed everything to give her granddaughter a chance at peace. The fire began building again, but this time she didn't fight it. Instead, she reached for the memory of every life she'd saved, every wound she'd healed, every moment when her touch had chosen creation over destruction. The light that answered her call was different now, still brilliant, still terrible in its purity, but tempered with purpose, rather than driven by fear. "I am not what you made me," she said, her voice carrying across the cavern with newfound authority. "I am what I choose to be." The shadow guards hesitated, sensing something in her tone that gave them pause. In that moment of uncertainty, Elara finally understood what her grandmother had tried to prepare her for. This was her heritage, her burden, her choice. The real ordeal was just beginning. The moment of understanding shattered like glass against stone. Elara stepped forward, light gathering around her hands with controlled precision, and felt the cavern floor give way beneath her feet. Not physically, the stone remained solid, but something far more fundamental crumbled as Morgana's lips curved into a smile that held centuries of malicious patience. "Did you think we came unprepared, little light-bearer?" The vampire lady's voice carried notes of triumph that made Elara's blood freeze. "Did you imagine your awakening was some happy accident we simply stumbled upon?" From the shadows behind the shadow guards, new figures emerged. Elara's heart stopped as she recognized them. Mrs. Aldrich, her silver hair disheveled, her kind eyes wide with terror. Willem, still pale from his recent fever, clutching his mother's hand. Henrik, his infected wound freshly bandaged, looking around the supernatural cavern with the bewildered fear of a child thrust into a nightmare. "No," Elara whispered, the light around her hands flickering like candles in a storm. "They have nothing to do with this." "They have everything to do with this," Morgana corrected, gesturing languidly. The shadow guards moved to flank the terrified humans, their void eyes fixed hungrily on mortal flesh. "We've been watching you for months, dear child, learning your routines, cataloging your weaknesses. Did you truly believe your grandmother's sacrifice could hide you forever?" Marcus cursed under his breath, his sword lowering as he realized their tactical situation had just become impossible. "Let them go, Morgana. Your quarrel is with the bloodline, not innocent villagers." "Innocent?" Lady Morgana laughed, the sound like silk being torn. "They harbored her, fed her, gave her reason to cling to that pathetic mortal existence instead of embracing her true nature." Her midnight eyes fixed on Elara with predatory satisfaction. "But more importantly, they represent the choice we're offering." Mrs. Aldrich tried to speak, but one of the shadow guards placed a clawed hand against her throat, not cutting, merely promising. The old woman's eyes found Elara's across the cavern, and in them was not accusation but the same fierce love that had raised an orphaned child with no questions asked. "The choice is simple," Morgana continued, her voice taking on the cadence of formal pronouncement. "Submit to our guidance. Allow us to shape your power for the good of the supernatural realm, and these mortals return safely to their beds. They'll remember nothing of tonight but troubled dreams." Elara felt the fire in her veins respond to her mounting rage, but she forced it down. Uncontrolled power had already broken Valdris, demonstrated exactly how dangerous she could be to innocent bystanders. "And if I refuse, then they die." Morgana's tone remained conversational, as if discussing the weather. "Not quickly, not cleanly, but in ways that will echo in your dreams for whatever brief time remains to you. The shadow guards haven't fed on mortal terror in quite some time." The light around Elara's hands guttered and died as the impossible weight of the choice crashed down upon her. Everything her grandmother had sacrificed, every year of peaceful anonymity, every careful lesson in choosing healing over harm, all of it meaningless in the face of this moment. She could fight. The power burning through her veins could probably destroy every shadow guard in the cavern, maybe even Morgana herself. But not before they killed the hostages. Not before Mrs. Aldrich died wearing the same expression of loving trust she'd shown when bandaging a child's scraped knee. "Ilara, no," Marcus said urgently, recognizing the defeat in her posture. "There has to be another way. We can—" "There is no other way," she whispered, her voice hollow as wind through empty rooms. The terrible irony wasn't lost on her. She'd finally learned to control her power just in time to discover it was useless. They planned this. They knew exactly what I'd choose. Vera's fingers had stopped working the wall mechanisms, her pale eyes wide with something that might have been pity. "The bloodline ends here," she said quietly. "Not in battle, not in glory, but in the same trap that's claimed peacekeepers for centuries, the inability to sacrifice the few for the many." Ilara looked at each beloved face in turn. Mrs. Aldrich with her gentle wisdom, Willem with his bright curiosity about her herb garden, Henrik who'd trusted her completely when infection threatened to claim his arm. People who'd given her purpose, identity, a reason to believe her gifts were meant for creation rather than destruction. The light died completely, leaving only the sickly phosphorescent glow of the fungi. When she spoke, her voice was steady despite the breaking of her heart. "I surrender." Morgana's smile was the last thing she saw before the shadow guards moved forward, their darkness swallowing everything she'd ever fought to protect.